titled Reapproaching Fellini, Gender, Race, Camp, Media. The first speaker today is Shelleen Greene, who is an associate professor of cinema and media studies in the Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the foremost expert in the relationship between critical race studies and Italian cinema. Her book, Equivocal Subjects Between Italy and Africa, Constructions of Racial and National Identity in the Italian Cinema, which was published by Bloomsbury Continuum in 2012, is the first to examine the representation of mixed race subjects in Italian and African descent in the Italian cinema. Her research interests include Italian cinema, Black European studies, and post-colonial studies. Her work has also been published in From Terrone to Extracomunitario, New Manifestations of Racism in Contemporary Italian Cinema, which was published in 2010, and Post-colonial Italy, Challenging National Homogeneity, which was published in 2012, and in the journal California Italian Studies. The title of Shelleen's paper is Racial Difference and the Post-colonial Imaginary in the Films of Federico Fellini. Shelleen?
Good morning.
Hi.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. I'd just like to say hello and to thank the Department of Italian Studies, the Cinema Studies Institute at the University of Toronto, and the Italian Cultural Institute in Toronto for their kind invitation to present at this centenary celebration of the life and work of Federico Fellini. And as Alberto noted, I will be presenting from part of a chapter that I've written for the Wiley Companion to Federico Fellini that was edited by Frank, Margie Waller, and Marita Gubareva. And this chapter is entitled Racial Difference and the Post-colonial Imaginary in the Films of Federico Fellini. And I would say that this chapter, I guess, was for me a bit experimental in many ways, because Fellini's films are not often examined through the lens of race and representation, or even considered in relation to Italy's colonial legacy. So I committed myself to a survey of sorts, from his early screenplay and directorial collaborations with Alberto Lattuada and the writer Ennio Flaiano, to his final films produced in, I guess, the postmodern era of the 80s and early 1990s. So rather than suggest a specific political position or ideology on the part of the director, I argue that Fellini's films incorporate racial difference as part of his broader representation of Italy's post-war era. While the chapter for the Wiley Companion to Federico Fellini looks at a range of films, from Variety Lights, The White Sheik, to the later works such as Ginger and Fred and The Voice of the Moon, I will focus my comments today on Fellini's first color film, The Temptations of Dr. Antonio, as an episode from the omnibus film, Boccaccio 70. And I guess I just wanted to share one image or a few images from this film for those who perhaps haven't seen it. Let me just share this. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, so these are stills from the film, and I'll talk about this shortly. Okay. Now, narrated by a cherubic Eros, the film tells the story of the tale of Dr. Antonio, a moralist whose indignation is provoked by the placement of a large billboard in a park directly in front of his apartment in the Rome Aor neighborhood, which displays a sensuous model played by Ekberg, lounging on a chaise, holding a glass of milk in front of her breast. At the top of the billboard is the phrase, "Bevete più latte," drink more milk. Despite Antonio's complaint to civil and church authorities, the billboard proves a great success, with crowds gathering to celebrate its sensuality and playfulness. One night, Dr. Antonio has a hallucination in which the billboard model comes alive as a 50-foot woman. As Ekberg walks through the city, she taunts Antonio, picking him up and cradling him in her large bosom. The hallucination ends, and the doctor is found the next morning, clutching the large billboard in his desire to possess the model. Now, of course, Ekberg's image, complexion, and hair, I would argue, exemplify an ideal beauty that harkens back in complex and contradictory ways to the fascist era, evoked by the film's setting in the Aor, where when Italian women negotiated their gendered identities among various images and imperatives. Italian women performed traditional roles as mothers of the nation, as opposed to African women associated with beauty, but also with primitivism, miscegenation, and contamination, and in relation to Hollywood beauty icons. So by the 1950s, the Italian ideal of feminine beauty was characterized by the voluptuous maggiorata figure, exemplified by Ekberg, but also by Italian actresses such as Sofia Loren and Silvana Mangiano, who provided a hybrid model of the traditional Italian woman between the maternal, populist every woman and the film icon. However, in this film, I suggest that Ekberg's excessive eroticism may also be read through a fascist era whiteness and its division between Aryan Mediterranean Italians and their African colonial subjects. In The Temptations, Ekberg's combination of hyper-whiteness and eroticism reveal the inherent instability of these ideologies of race and racial hierarchy. Her sexuality takes on significations of primitivism and sensuality often associated with non-white subjects. In the film, Ekberg is associated with blonde hair, white milk, and the dazzling, bright neoclassical architecture of the Aor. At one point in the film, Antonio hurls black ink at Ekberg's Bevette Pilate billboard, an allusion to the darkness he perceives in Ekberg's transgressive sexuality. In fact, the references to Ekberg as evil or the devil suggest that she is so white, she is black. The press coverage of the film's production noted the meticulous scale model reproduction of Aor used for Ekberg's 50-foot sequence. The Roman neighborhood was first constructed by the fascist regime to celebrate the capture of Addis Ababa in the Italian-Ethiopian War. And later, the Aor commemorated the fascist Ventennio and was to have served as a site of the 1942 World's Fair. It remained incomplete at the end of World War II, but by the early 1960s became a residential community. As Karen Pincus argues, the Aor was, quote, inherently tied to Italian colonialism, a conceptual and psychological reflection of what Italy aspired to achieve in its empire. Pinker further notes that Antonio's L'Eclisse, the Aor becomes a site for the non-event of Italian decolonization and the lack of a language with which to articulate an Italian post-colonial condition. The settings for The Temptation of Dr. Antonio thus opens provocative links among Ekberg's hyper-whiteness, Antonio's repressed sexual impulses, and fascist racial ideologies. In a later scene, as Antonio speaks in front of the billboard to a Boy Scout troop about his boyhood sexual temptations, crowds begin to gather, among them a busload of African-American musicians. The musicians play a jazzy version of one of the themes from La Dolce Vita, and when one of the workers asks them to stop so that they can test the more conventional musical accompaniment for the advertisement, the musicians appropriate the tune and sync with the pre-recorded music. They then parade along the periphery of the park, slowly making their way into the crowd of white Italians. Their appropriation of both Fellini's La Dolce Vita music and that of the billboard ad resist Antonio's form of hegemonic authoritarianism. Set against the pale blues and whites of Aor's minimalist architecture, the Black musician's presence comments ironically on the fascist project, challenging the racial segregation hierarchies that fascist colonial architecture sought to produce and secure. By placing the Black musicians in the national space, The Temptation suggests an awareness of the racial and gender discourses that subtend the Italian national project. The Ekberg billboard, meanwhile, is a projection of Antonio's latent sexual desires, which later become manifest as an overpowering, monstrous Ekberg who rampages through the Aor. As Ekberg comes to life, she begins to move through the miniaturized Aor, her image often appearing in front of the film's model of the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, the building most associated with fascist neoclassicism. Her cascading bleached blonde hair, bosom, white skin eventually drive Antonio insane. The Temptations can be read as a destabilizing consequence of the compulsory whiteness articulated in the 1938 Manifesto of Racial Sciences. the document that served as the basis for the racial policies of the fascist regime. This is emphasized in a self-referential gesture in the sequence, in which Antonio, attempting to hide Ekberg's striptease performance, repeatedly throws his black jacket in front of the camera, shouting, "Don't look." The sequence directs us to the scopophilic nature of the medium, a pleasure which Antonio seeks to suppress. However, it also exposes the constitutive role of Blackness in the formation of cinematic images. By implication, the sequence, as does the film as a whole, reveals the socio-historical constructedness of race. The film's ending reinforces the consequences of abjecting Blackness. The song Bevete Pulate mockingly accompanies Antonio's encasement in a white straitjacket and removal in a white ambulance, the mischievous Eros on top, a little white angel, singing the film's Ode to Milk. From his early post-war films, including Variety Lights, The White Sheik, to mid-career works such as The Temptations and Satyricon, to his late films Ginger and Fred and Voice of the Moon, Fellini engages fascism and its colonialist legacies by evoking racial discourses pertaining to whiteness and ethnic and cultural difference within Italy. In re-encountering Fellini's films through the framework of Italian racial identity construction and the nation's colonial legacies, we can extend the analytic parameters by which we read Fellini as film auteur and can discern a critical awareness of racial discourse within his expansive vision of post-war Italian society. And I'd like to end by showing some additional images from the film, since I can't show clips. Here is, again, the periphery of Aor and the introduction of the Black musicians. Here are the Black musicians as they interrupt the space of the park. Here is just a scene, a clip, a photograph of them on set. And you can see that basically for this film, they built a miniature reproduction of Aor. And here is Anita Ekberg being directed by Fellini. Here they are on the set. You can see the monument in the back. Ekberg as the 50-foot woman. All right, and thank you for letting me present. These are some ideas that I've tried to work through in my paper, and I look forward to feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shelleen. I adore this reading of Le Tentazioni del Dottor Antonio, because it really kind of attempts to unearth the colonial unconscious that's part of the air and of everything that then is filmed in the air and has to contend, with the legacy of those buildings. I don't think the sentence, "She is so white, she is black," will ever leave my vocabulary from now on every time I actually see this film and teach this film. Thank you again for this reading. I'm going to introduce the next speaker, and then we'll reconvene at the end of the panel for an extended Q&A. The next speaker is a dear friend, Eleonora Lima, who is at Trinity College, Dublin. Eleonora is a Marie Sklodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Italian at Trinity College, Dublin, and a fellow of the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute, where she is working on a project titled Mapping Remediation in Italian Literature Beyond the Digital Revolution, devoted to the intermedial dialogue between Italian literature and computer science from the 1950s to the present. Previously a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, she holds a PhD in Italian from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she also completed a minor degree in media studies with a focus on film and television criticism. Her latest book is titled Le tecnologie dell'informazione nella scrittura di Italo Calvino e Paolo Volponi, tre storie di rimediazione, and it was published by Florence University Press in 2019. Eleonora, the title of her paper is Fellini's Note on Camp to John Waters.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you all the organizer for this opportunity. As you can understand from the brief bio, I'm not a specialist, and I hope I'm going to be able to contribute in a meaningful way to the conference, and I look forward to feedback and discussion. Let me see if I can share. Can you see it? Okay. Okay, yes. My presentation is about Fellini's note on camp to John Waters. In 1963, Fellini's 8½" premiere at the Charles Theatre in Baltimore, and John Waters, later to be known as the Pope of Trash, was in attendance. Waters was then only 17, and with his career as an independent filmmaker yet to begin. And the ruler that you see here is a souvenir of that night, which Waters kept in his personal archives since. As Waters later declared, 8½" and Fellini's cinema more in general had a deep impact on him and his fellow Dreamlanders, Waters' group of friends who regularly feature in his early films. And it was with the Dreamlanders that a young Waters often liked to indulge in LSD-fueled screening of Juliet of the Spirits. And that Fellini's and Waters' penchant for the grotesque were not too dissimilar was clear to film critic Pauline Kael as early as 1970, when she wrote a review for The New Yorker comparing Fellini's Satyricon to Waters' first feature-length film Mondo Trescio as a way to insult the work of the Italian director. In her comparison of Fellini's Mondo Trescio, Fellini's film to Mondo Trescio, Kael describes Satyricon, and I'm quoting, as one long orgy of eating, drinking, cruelty, and copulation, of freaks who painted faces and protruding tongues, in which Fellini goes all the way with his infatuation with transvestitism, nymphomania, homosexuality, monsters. And to be sure, this was precisely what Waters tried to accomplish. It was, however, a case of Waters lending from Fellini rather than the maestro borrowing from the young director. And indeed, as Vito Zagario notes in his newly published essay for the companion to Federico Fellini, John Waters' films have an undeniable Fellinesque quality. And I just wanted to show some shots in which Waters' fascination for Fellini's cinema is evident. Saragina's unruly body and grotesque sexual appeal seem to be a source of inspiration for the character of Edith in Waters' Pink Flamingo. Similarly, the tobacconist in Amarcord reminds of Edith in Female Trouble. Here, Carla's weird makeup in 8½" that she puts on when Guido asks her to look slutty is mirrored by Divine's makeup in Pink Flamingos. And you have also other shots in which it seems that Waters took inspiration from Fellini's characters. And even Divine's hairdo in Pink Flamingo seems to be inspired by another of Fellini's character, Casanova, as they both weirdly shave their hairline. And, or for example, here you can see their shared taste for grotesque and deformed faces in this shot from Fellini's Satyricon, where this woman is supposed to look like an old fresco, and Divine in Female Trouble, here victim of an acid attack. So Fellini's influence, however, is not limited to these purely visual elements. And the reason Waters must have found Fellini's work so congenial to the extent that he decided to appropriate it must reside in Fellini's camp aesthetics. And according to Susan Sontag, camp is the love of the unnatural, of artifice and exaggeration. Camp sensitivity allows to recognize bad taste and to appreciate it and celebrate it. And this awareness is precisely what distinguishes camp from kitsch, because kitsch is instead the experience of somebody who mistakes tackiness for luxury. And that Fellini was well-versed in camp sensitivity did not escape Sontag, who listed the self-parody of Anita Ekberg in La Dolce Vita as one of the highest examples of camp, together with Tiffany lamps, feathers, beady dresses, King Kong, Machiste, and Flash Gordon comics, all elements that are present and important for Fellini's work. So it is clear that Fellini owned the language of camp aesthetics, but why did he recur to it, and why camp was so congenial to him? I believe that the reason behind Fellini's penchant for camp are precisely what intrigued and inspired Waters. First of all, camp is about transgressing the boundaries between good and bad taste, high and low culture. And this is an important constant in Fellini's work, which famously contaminate art cinema with popular genre. The lesson was quickly learned by Waters, who often declares that all he ever wanted to make are, his words, exploitation movies for art theaters. And just to give you two quick examples of the playful contamination at work in the two directors' films, let's consider, for example, Fellini's Toby Dammit. Here, the protagonist is cast to play in a Catholic Western movie about Jesus' second coming as a cowboy. However, this odd and almost sacrilegious project was not Fellini's original idea, but instead the plot of Mark Twain's short story, The Second Advent. Similarly, the infamous closing scene in Waters' Pink Flamingo, in which Divine eats dog's feces, hides a very cultural reference to Jean Genet's statement, "Poetry is the art of using shit and make you eat it." So the celebration of bad taste, be it Catholic Western movie or coprophagy, therefore succeed in blurring the lines between high and low culture. However, and this is the second reason why camp sensitivity works well for Fellini and consequently for Waters, the adoption of bad taste aesthetics has nothing to do with satire nor reflects a moral stance. As Sontag points out, the whole point of camp is to dethrone the serious. Therefore, camp aesthetics neutralizes moral indignation, sponsor playfulness, because it is above all a mode of enjoyment, of appreciation. It relishes rather than judges. And in this respect, it is telling that Fellini tried to stop the many overinterpretations of La Dolce Vita by saying, "I believe I never had any specific intention to denounce, criticize, scourge, or satirize," which is the same point that Guido, Fellini's double, makes at the end of 8½. "I truly have nothing to say, but I want to say it anyway," which is also the same answer Waters often gives when asked about his visually provocative film. "I am really not trying to say anything." Indeed, Fellini and Waters refuse to take any moral stance and instead engage with their subjects on a purely aesthetic level for the visual and comedic pleasure that they produce. And let's consider, for instance, two of their treatment of Catholic iconography. Probably one of the campiest scenes in the history of cinema is the Vatican fashion show in Fellini's Roma. In a crescendo that culminates with the Pope framed by feathers fans, we are presented with priests on roller skates, nuns with dove-shaped hats, and cardinals dressed in neon lights. However, as David Inglis and Chris Torpe points out, the scene is essentially an exercise in theatricality. Fellini wants us to marvel at the exuberant and dramatic quality of Catholic rites rather than to provoke our disdain for the Church's immoral love for luxury. And similarly, Waters, who has also a Catholic upbringing, declares that, and I'm quoting, "being Catholic always makes you more theatrical." And indeed, theatricality is what fascinated him the most about Catholicism. One example is the reenactment of the Passion of Christ in Multiple Maniacs. While Waters mentioned Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew as one of his sources of inspiration, the scene retains nothing of the sober tone of Pasolini's film. In the Gospel According to Waters, Jesus turns a loaf of bread and fishes, as you can see, into a mountain of canned tuna and packages of pre-sliced bread, and his followers count among them Divine, a drag queen wrapped up in bed sheets. Like in Fellini's Vatican fashion show, theatricality, comedic elements, and a penchant for the grotesque is what interested Waters, not a pointed criticism towards the church. Offending the Catholics is an inevitable consequence of the two directors' camp aesthetic, not their main goal. And here comes the last reason why camp sensitivity suited Fellini and in turn Waters best. Camp, we said, is the love of the unnatural and therefore allows to unveil the artificiality of social conventions, gender identities, and reality at large. Camp is Anita Ekberg in La Dolce Vita when, by offering a parody of herself as a diva, shows how both cinema and femininity are for Fellini nothing but a projection of male desire. Camp is Giulietta, her sisters, her neighbor Susie, who overperform stereotypical female types, all exaggerated because all artificial. Camp is Divine, who gives us a twisted version of Elizabeth Taylor, a hypersexualized and queer version of femininity, a failed and clumsy wife and housewife, all of these in drag. However, this artificiality is embraced and celebrated in the spirit of Camp. Indeed, Fellini and Waters do succeed in deconstructing, or at least questioning, stereotypes and fixed identity, but not in order to replace them with something more genuine. They simply recognize them as performances and exploit their theatricality for comedic purposes. And there would be much more to say about the ways in which Fellini Camp's aesthetic has influenced John Waters, and I hope there will be the chance to discuss it further during the Q&A. But what I hope I've been able to achieve is to demonstrate how Fellini wasn't for Waters simply an illustrious representative of art cinema, whose style Waters then contaminated with references to B-movie and pop culture. This pastiche, this contamination instead, is the essence of Fellini's camp sensitivity that Waters appropriated and dutifully applied. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleonora. That's, again, another very enlightening reading. And now, you know, it's going to be a tall challenge to now teach Fellini without thinking about John Waters and try to find ways, you know, I think it has to become, you know, part of the practice now to try to find ways to, in fact, include John Waters in the Fellini syllabus. So thank you for showing me that avenue, which I had not explored to the degree that you have. And aside from our quick conversations once in a while, and this is really fascinating work. Thank you so much. I'm going to move ahead to our next speaker, who is Dishani Samarasinghe from the Université du Québec à Montréal. Dishani is a PhD student in communication at the Université du Québec à Montréal and works on the notion of the human figure through the frame in the relationship between cinema and painting. She was awarded a bachelor's degree in visual arts and a double master's degree in cinema in Paris. She has worked in cinema and theater decor construction and as an assistant in production workshops for film methodology courses. She has been a rapporteur of the Composite editorial board, an electronic journal of young researchers in communication. Her paper will interrogate the relationship between films and drawings in Fellini, taking into account both Fellini's own drawing production and the influence of other painters on his work, from Toulouse-Lautrec to Picasso. The title of the paper is What Woman for Which Frame? About framing between film and painting in Federico Fellini's work. Dishani?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you very much, Alberto, for this presentation. Also, thank you all for this organization, for this conference. It's mean a lot. Just to inform you that you may hear my little lovely monster is sick today. That means that we don't can get him to the daycare. Then he's at the living room with with his father and my husband. Then just don't pay attention if you can't, if you cannot. It's okay. He will do the presentation with me. Anyway, I will share my presentation, just a minute. Okay. Everyone can see the PowerPoint, yes? Okay. Here we go. Okay. Okay, today I would like then in my presentation to talk about women in Fellini's film. We know this fascination, this adoration of women in Fellini's work by studying his drawing and analyzing an ideal pictorial dialogue, I would like to observe how and by what means do these women appear in cinematographic frame, associating cinema and painting. For this, I will obviously help myself with some of his work, both pictorial works, especially his drawing, but also cinematographic work. Different film presenting multi kind of image of women, I mean by narrative way and also iconographic way, will be determining in my proposition. The central role of women and the pictorial atmosphere that image through sitting in frame are notable and will be analyzed in Night of Cabiria. Just a minute. Okay, yes. Night of Cabiria, 8½, Juliet of the Spirit, Satyricon, and La Cité del Don. That is to say that the link between cinema and painting will be at the heart of my remark through the representation of women. We are all familiar with Hava Al-Dubey's remarkable work and research. Here, I will rely on her writing, on her book, Federico Fellini, Painting in Film and Painting on Film. In her book, Hava mentioned precisely the reference, influence, and symbol of painting and painter in Fellini's cinematographic work. Indeed, in the film Torbid Amit, we can see the stroke of the flesh and the meat of certain disturbing painting by Francis Bacon, or passing by Rembrandt representation. But also the allusion to the painter Chirico for the aspect of dream, of deconstruction of space in his film, through Satyricon, Fellini's Casanova, or Juliet of the Spirit. Reference to the work of Bruegel to Brooklyn for this vast enchanted landscape that Fellini reveals to us under very large cinematography overall shot. Hava Al-Dubey's work is a very relevant and unique analysis to bring this universe of cinematic painting intermediality that Fellini introduced in his film. As Rugen Miller said about the intermediality, he said our notion of intermediality does not consider not the media as isolated phenomena, but as a means to promote the process where there are constant interaction between concept process that should not be confused with the media process with a simple addition. With this interaction in his work, but we will find some kind of this interaction on the work of Fellini between cinema and painting. Fellini has a very subtle way of integrating this pictorial medium into this moving image. I mean the notion of moving image by the notion of Deleuze. Taking up the word of Julia Kristeva in the book of the Revolution of Poetic Language, she conceived of intertextuality as the passage from one system of sign to another. Then, by this sentence of Julia Kristeva, can we assume this rite of passage in Fellini's work? I mean the fact, for example, of passing from one of his dream to drawing, then for drawing to moving image. Fellini calls himself as a creator of story, a creator of image. This image thought through his dream try to find their way onto his paper and then onto the film stock. These images are transformed, modified, metamorphosed in the course of this process like a film. I mean like a film, like we begin for the passage of writing, then the storyboarding, then shooting and editing. Here with Fellini, we go through dreams, paper, filming and editing. The concept of intermediality is therefore necessary and complementary insofar as it supports the process of meaning production linked to media interaction. We note that this intermediate aesthetic of cinema is visible in many examples of film nowadays, like the theorician Jaqueline said on his work, on the book of L'œil interminable. He used the term of cinématisation, or in French, le devenir cinéma de la peinture. In English, cinematic becoming of painting. Now, with Fellini, Fellini has always drawn throughout his career. He managed to exploit outside of the cinematic aspect his universe, his vision, and his emotion. These drawings that we can see are often characterized by very spontaneous, punctual, taken on the spot in his abyss, his dream. The act of drawing only involves a piece of paper and a pencil, while the act of filming involves a whole team. This is a sentence by Anne Hendry, who was the curator of the exhibition of What's Up Federico at the Musée des Beaux-Arts at Nancy. Fellini's cinema is as close as he can get to this pictorial universe, but this does not prevent his drawing from prevailing over his faithful universe. The first step of his creation is to draw. Thereafter that, the most difficult thing is to find an actor or an actress that will correspond to the drawing he made. However, the portrait of relatives, their caricature, are met with softer, sometimes more childish features, especially for Giulietta Massina or even Marcello Mastroianni. On the other hand, in his more spontaneous drawing, where the erotic aspect comes into play, we have lines, choruses, curves, darker, the strokes are thicker, and it is loosened. The situation is less under control. His drawing have a fundamental value of the creation of his character in a physical way, but also in his character. We observe very clearly characteristic features that are repeated all the time, so much in his drawing of character and as in the character of his film. With this, we can see the outrageous caricature with this important place to the sex. Women possess attributes that are sometimes completely disproportionate compared to the men who feel crushed by this immensity. These women take on all kinds of appearance and symbolism, such as the Sefarazza, the Doctoressa, Donatella, etc. The drawing is a step used by Fellini for the filmic production. His women can be imagined under several archetypes, like attractive, creepy, hypersexual, and associated with the ideal woman, divine beauty, sexual mirage, mother figure, etc., etc. That's why Han Hendry, then the curator of the exhibition, said that this is the eternal, all-powerful woman, at once dominating and protective, maternal and erotic, who welcomed the little man between her breasts, on her enormous teeth. A Fellinian fantasy found in many of his films. It is also a typical fantasy of the male child, the lost and the forbidden paradise of the little boy. The gigantic woman crushed from her stature, the end of a man who looked at the immensity of the feminine universe with hate. Beside of that, like on the book of Hava Haldubiz, she noticed that we can see some kind of similarity with the painting and the painter. And Hava talked about the similarity with Toulouse-Lautrec and also Picasso. Indeed, we see some kind of similarity with the painting of Toulouse-Lautrec, especially in this way of drawing the form of naked woman to resume the atmosphere of the world of prostitution and wantonness, like, for example, on the movie of Night of Cabiria. Also, a little kind of influence of Picasso painting also seem embodied through the extremely generous form of this woman, but also with destructured and deformed body. As Hava explained, there is some kind of Fellini reference and influence for the painter, like also we can see with Klimt, and also the Segantini, Beardsley, with all the idea of the femme fatale, and also with the symbolism of the red hair of the woman, that all this kind of idea and theme we can see on the film of Juliet of the Spirit, and also with Satyricon. Through all these women, Fellini reveals parallel problem also by the narrative way, notably the problem of the condition of women in a patriarchal society, with the film, of course, the most film important about the feminists. It's about the city of women, but also the world of the prostitution, like we just saw before with the Cabilla's night of Cabilla, sorry. And also kind of idea of the quest for women's emancipation with this idea, we can see this idea on the movie of Juliet of the Spirit. Now, finally, to conclude and to close the presentation, I would like to conclude with a sentence of Fellini. Like he said about the painting, that what would I have wanted to do with this film, Fellini's Casanova, is to arrive once and for all at the ultimate essence of cinema, at what, in my opinion, is the total film, to succeed, that is, in turning a film into a painting. That means that for him, like, the total film will be like the painting that he wants to create. Thank you for your attention. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Dishani. This was really enlightening. I love that you ended with Casanova, which is the film I wrote about for the companion, and that's the fact that we can think about Fellini as a painter as opposed to a filmmaker is something that I suggest my students to kind of think about all the time when they're approaching Fellini. Also to kind of puncture some of the myths and some of the misunderstandings about the direct relationship between autobiography and the films themselves. And I love the way you kind of mapped out how the imagery of the films is actually part of 20th century painting, and and there's a strong circulation of this particular kind of of visual arts that becomes kind of like common coinage that is exchanged with between the films and the paintings. Thanks again for this is really lovely and really enlightening. I'm going to move on to our last speaker for the day before we have an extended Q&A. And our last speaker is Jaqueline Reich from Fordham University. Jaqueline is a professor and chair at the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University in New York. Her research concerns Italian and Italian-American cinema, the relationship between fashion and cinema, and the representation of the male body in Italian and American visual culture of the 20th century. Among her several publications, she has published Beyond the Latin Lover, Marcello Mastroianni, Masculinity and Italian Cinema with Indiana University Press in 2004, and The Machista Films of Italian Silent Cinema, again with Indiana University in University Press in 2015. Her paper for today is titled Fellini and Stardom, Reconsidered for the Digital Age. Jaqueline?
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thanks for organizing this conference. It's very fitting that we are now in the virtual world for my talk, because I'll be talking about Fellini and social media. Just one quick correction. Thankfully, I am no longer chair of the department. My biography was written before when I was still chair, and just wanted to clarify that. So I'm just a lowly professor, happily returning to my scholarship after 7 years. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Fellini, Stardom, and digital reproduction. I want to sort of I was thinking about some of the things that have already been said today, what Atamogoyan talked about in terms of Fellini as an influencer. I'm not going to try to make that argument, but it might come up later. Also a kind of trying to think about it also from an intersectional perspective. This is new research drawing on some work that I've been doing recently on what I've called the digital afterlife of Italian cinema. And this is specifically just focusing on Fellini and his image, director as star. And I'm going to set my timer because I do have a tendency to talk a lot. Okay, the director is auteur, director is star, and the collaboration of a director with stars. These are paradigms with which the scholar who approaches Fellini within the theoretical and disciplinary traditions of star and celebrity studies. But new forms of media, streaming, social, and participatory, obfuscate these traditional signifying practices in the creation, distribution, and consumption of a director's public image. Whereas once an auteur had relative control over the production, distribution, and exhibition of mostly his public persona, digital technology has complicated radically that idea in an age of reproduction beyond perhaps Walter Benjamin's wildest imagination. The media consumer has indeed morphed into the media producer. Representational media is at the service of presentational media, and the spreadability of those products have created multiple opportunities to deepen the ways in which we understand how fans and stars, dead and alive, interact with one another. Films and stars are texts that need to be understood in light of the complexity of the discourses in which they circulate. With the ever-increasing multiplicity of points of contact with the text, we must understand each new medium's codes and conventions, processes of signification, and circulation practices. Embracing the new and understanding its connection to the old reveal how enduring the relationship between star and fan and scholar and media remains. Today, I propose a brief foray into what I've called the digital afterlife of Federico Fellini. What are the images of the director that circulate on photo-dominated social media platforms of Instagram and Pinterest? I'll be looking mostly at Instagram today. And how are they contextualized through user interface? Does their meaning change through the multiplication of channels of distribution and infinite replications? How do the particularities of each of these social media platforms, interface, user profile, these are generally what we would consider female gendered platforms, participate in the creation of new meanings attached to Fellini's public photographic representation? How are these images contextualized? And lastly, how might we take an intersectional approach to the analysis of these images? For the purposes of my argument, I distinguish between stardom and celebrity along discursive as well as historical lines. I continue to employ the term star, stardom, and star persona in order to deliberately engage with the historical discourses and textual reference that circulate with Fellini's star persona in relation to film, Italy, and Italian cinema. In the age of digital, convergent, and participatory media, we are still reminded of Daniel Borsten's assertion that a celebrity is known for his or her well-knownness, but not necessarily that stardom is about talent. The increased dilution of the distinction between public and private adds to the democratization of celebrity culture and its ubiquity. The effect of these changes in the production and consumption of star and celebrity discourses, as well as the shift to multiple means of fan engagement, necessitate a re-examination of the relationship among star, text, and fan. Like the film serials that helped give birth to the American star system, or the scrapbooks fans assembled about their favorite star, stardom and in turn fandom have always been convergent from their very inception in the first decades of the 20th century. Cross-platform, intermedial, as our previous speaker spoke about, and participatory with an active fan culture. Social media has heightened and multiplied those encounters, as has the proliferation of commodity culture. In Fellini's case, the director's status as brand. There's always been a strong connection between Fellini, marketing, and branding. In addition to his commercial work, Ginger and Friend satirizes the intersection of commodity culture and television through characteristically exaggerated advertisements and product placements, and similarly, The Temptation of Dr. Antonio. Yet, as Rebecca Bauman has recently showed, Fellini is himself a brand, signifying, quote, craftsmanship, creativity, italianità, hedonism, and fun. Fellini himself became a tool for marketing his own films with above-the-billing title, and the Fellini name has been co-opted by multiple international products and businesses. In the 21st century, Bauman argues, with multiple references to multiple references to restaurants, such as Gradiska in New York City and Amarcord in Beacon, which is just a few miles from where I sit today, Fellini as brand is not simply shorthand for Italianness or Fellini's particular film style, but rather, quote, a symbol of quality and cosmopolitan capital that flatters consumers by implying that they are in the know. P. David Marshall's work on persona studies notes how social media platforms, particularly those that are visually based, provide stages through which people produce consumable public versions of themselves and monitor those productions of self daily. Most of the work by Marshall, Alice Marwick and Dana Boyd, and Elizabeth Elsesser has focused on living and breathing stars, celebrities, and micro-celebrities. But many of these images that circulate in the new specular economy are of the long and recently dead. Betty Page, Elizabeth Taylor, Michael Jackson, and David Bowie are prominent examples, names that are also on the highest earning dead celebrities over the last 5 years, according to Forbes.com. Some stars maintain strict control over the circulation of their digital image in both life and death, thanks to zealous pursuit by personal and estate copyright infringement lawyers. Others exercise little or no control. In the case of dead stars, the discursive interchange between fan and star is often one of nostalgia and ritual. Paul Booth finds multiple dichotomies in fan practices, such as the tension between consumer and producer, fan production itself as resistant and complicit, and most significantly for this topic, a play between novelty and nostalgia. The new products that fans produce through pastiche and engage with the nostalgia via the sense of the text. The rituals are provided by cultural norms of the passage of time, birthdays, anniversaries, deaths, and commemoration of films, the reason why we are here today. Thus, the star's text of connection, that's Elsesser's term, endures beyond the grave. Representational media joins with presentational media to create new possibility and archives of fan culture and new opportunities for parasocial interactions, even those imagined. The star as text, image, and icon replicates itself easily in the digital world. The question to examine in this case is, what does Fellini mean in these recycled and reconstructed representations, using Mary Desjardins' terms, and what do their digital lives say about how this Italian cinematic imaginary is consumed on the smallest of screens? Frank Burke acknowledges the cultural capital associated with Fellini's name and the strong mythology around the maestro in both Italy and the Anglo-American world. Social media interactions between users and their subjects negotiate the space between Fellini as brand and Fellini as star, creating points of contact and new meanings. A brief example, and with the help of with a current and former graduate student in Fordham's public media program, Desi Stoeva and Rachel Meyer, I turned to recent posts, so 2020 posts on Instagram, to interrogate these encounters in the American context, with Fellini's name translated as various hashtags related to the centenary of his birth. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up my PowerPoint and sort of show some of these images. So on Instagram, we searched different hashtags, 4 different hashtags. Fellini, Federico Fellini, Fellini 100, and Federico Fellini 100. They're not case sensitive. I came to learn. Instagram is not my forte, so I'm relying on the expertise of my colleagues. Here, let me go here. Right. So this was the most popular post, and you could see there's a photo of Fellini and Mazzina. We have a photo here. If anybody, I'll also be really happy to crowdsource these photos if you know who took them, because rarely are photos credited on Instagram, right? So here we have most likely a shot from the set of 8.5. This one is actually one of the few credited ones. Here we are with Federico Fellini and him accepting an award with Mastroianni. Here we have Mastroianni and Egbert in 8.5 on the set of La Dolce Vita, with a little bit of wonderful cues of interpretation here. Him in Sordi. And again, with Fellini 100, we return to this photo from the set of La Dolce Vita. Another one, again, returning from 8.5. And here's another one, right, of him drinking coffee with his Academy Award. And some other related to Fellini 100, him and Mazzina. Nope, sorry, this is Egbert. And Fellini here. So these are just, I'm sort of just flipping through them so you get a sense of what we have, what is available. So now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to draw some conclusions very briefly. So what you see in these images is a reliance on stars and onset photographs, right? I should also say that this is just a snapshot, and I haven't compared his representation in social media or the circulation of his images in social media to other directors. Like I was thinking, or one of my graduate students pointed out about Godard or some other European and American auteurs, although Godard is living, so it's a little bit of a different comparison. You do see some examples of a kind of iconography of Italianità, right? Like him drinking the coffee, etc. But what I find really fascinating, and I think this speaks to a kind of this idea of nostalgia, is the sort of iconography of intimacy that you see in these images that are reproduced. Either intimacy with others in the photo, right? And a sort of blatant also sexual playfulness that is often lacking in others, but in other images. But what you do also see, and I think this sort of goes back to a little bit of the kind of representation that I did in a previous study on social media of Marcello Mastroianni, is that this kind of image of Italian masculinity very much tied to a flirtatious sexuality that is often, that was proliferated in the idea of Mastroianni as Latin lover, and seems to be kind of attached as well to Fellini in these settings. This is, again, just kind of a brief snapshot of what we might see in social media of Fellini and how his image is consumed. And sort of the next step of this research is really to kind of problematize this from a sort of a race, gender, and class perspective in terms of who's doing the sharing, what does this say about the way Fellini sort of fits into a kind of new 21st century sensibility and what he represents. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting research because it seems to me that it almost stems from, you know, the beginning of kind of the typical can you hear me? The typical sort of the transforming Fellini also into a font as much, you know, as a brand, which started fairly early in his career. And these are kind of collections of screenplays that were published almost simultaneously with the release of certain films in the States. This is from 1971. 1970. And it's interesting to me that how that also connects with Dishani's argument, you know, of Fellini's kind of like enmeshment with both painting and also design. You know, Lautrec, of course, we're thinking about posters, so it has some kind of you know, legacy and attachment to graphic signs, and that then evolves into the meme. I love the way that you brought the meme into the conversation, because you know that animates and the photograph in a number of different ways that can be then reinterpreted, and meaning can be grafted upon it. You know, and that's the participatory nature of course of social media. So I could babble on forever, but I'd rather hear more from these incredible panelists that we've had today, and we are perfectly on time, and this is remarkable for, you know, any conference. And so I would actually like to start from you, Jackie, and to hear if you have any further thoughts about this, the idea of sort of like you know, the circulation, but also the remediation of Fellini you know, in other avenues that are not strictly sort of like film related, which seems to be sort of related but also tangential perhaps to your work. So I don't want to push it in an avenue where it's not productive, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
So as usual, one goes into a project thinking one thing and coming out with a completely different hypothesis and or different resources. So my thought actually coming into this was that most of the photos that I would see would be from sort of paparazzi images, or from taken by Tazio Secchiaroli, one of the main photographers of Fellini, and that did not prove to be the case. I sort of thought that those would be the more kind of ubiquitous images that I would find, and certainly not. I did a very quick Google search, and the most popular one that came up is Fellini with the whip from the set of 8½. But in terms of social media posts and what circulated, certainly not. I mean, I would love to start to think about GIFs and other kind of different kinds of memes and ideas that circulate. But what I was really struck by was this kind of intimacy, and that from the way what you saw in these photographs was not necessarily an intimacy between fan and director, right? But a sort of where you would normally see a kind of like a close-up, right? Or like you would with Mastroianni, you would often see close-ups. You would see him, you know, dressed very fashionably, smoking a cigarette, etc. Here, as opposed, we see a couple of images of him actually filming, but most of them are sort of on-set, very candid moments of a kind of intimacy between subjects within the frame. And that was something that I did not get at all. I mean, you had a couple of them with Mastroianni and Ekberg when I did my research on how La Dolce Vita was circulated. But so those are kinds of things I think I'm going to need to explore a little bit more. Also, looking at and doing more research, and this is why I tried to crowdsource this on Facebook. I got a couple of hits in terms of sources. Where these images appear the first time, right? That's really important for someone who works on film history. You know, what was the original context where these were they published in a book? Were they in newspapers? So I'll have to do a little bit of archival work in terms of looking at the source and then seeing how they're coming back. But what you also see here, just very quickly, is that there's very little connection to film. So you don't see film stills, right? So with Mastroianni, for instance, and how he circulates on social media from my previous research, what I found was that there is an increasing divide between image and source material and film, right? It's completely reappropriated and retextualized. And recreated, which would sort of speak to the role of the media consumer as now media producer, right? And so those are the things that I think are extremely interesting. But again, this warrants, my findings were very surprising. And so they beg for a little bit more examination before I could fully answer your question, Alberto.
I actually just wanted to share this with you. I shared it earlier, and I think it has to do with what, you know, in a way you're talking about in terms of the anchoring to the actual text, where the card that I was showing earlier is actually a series of 4 that were this limited edition kind of thing that a restaurant in Toronto called L'Unità did. And the icons that they choose are actually Marcello, of course, from Fellini, you know, strictly attached to Fellini, Lorraine, and icons of Italian mobility, which in a way kind of like speaks to the, you know, the anchoring or the not anchoring that to the text itself, into a different, you know, it can be an idea of style that may or may not, in fact, originate from a Fellini film.
I would also say that, again, a kind of nostalgia here, because it's a very sort of historicized version of Italianità, right? A historicized commodification of Italianità, of the old car, the Vespa, right? And icons from the 60s at the height of a sort of Italian economic boom and the made in Italy phenomenon.
Yeah, it's emigrants nostalgia, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So Frank had a question, I believe, for you. Frank, you may go ahead.
Hi. Yes, thanks, Jackie. It's great stuff. One thing that occurred to me is without the Centenary, you would have found a lot less material, I think. So much of it was done, a lot of it was Fellini 100, which is the Rimini celebration. So I wonder, you know, 5 years down the line, how visible Fellini would be on social media. And the other thought I had, I really liked what you said about Fellini and intimacy, because that also displaces the photographer of star, that you don't find Secchiaroli. Instead, you find a certain kind of image of Fellini. And one of the things that, with all the work I've done the last couple of years on Fellini and meeting people who are close to him, etc., it actually does reflect something quite significant about him, which was his ability to create intimacy on the set, and a community of people around him who really loved him and he loved in return. So I thought that was really interesting that gets reflected. And of course, the social media you're talking about are social media that emphasize not formality or professionalism, but rather intimacy, the intimacy of chats and so forth and so on.
Thank you. Those are really helpful observations, Frank. It's good to see you, by the way.
Yes, you too.
And a couple of thoughts. So one of the things that you find about social media is that regardless, on a star or a public figure's birthday, there's actually a hashtag called Born on This Day, and you will see a lot of tributes. So regardless of it, whenever it is Fellini's birthday, you do see sort of a sort of proliferation of celebrations. So it also speaks to a kind of ritualization that we're seeing on social media for these moments of memory, right? I think memory, nostalgia, etc. In terms, so I think his visibility would still be there. Also, there are occasions, right? I'm sure now, I didn't know about the 4K reproduction or reissue of 8.5. I'm sure we'll see some new posts based on that. And it'll be interesting to see what comes up in terms of that. And I love this idea of the ability to, to create intimacy on the set and those things. And my question is, why is it that fans are drawn to those particular images, right? What is it that what are they looking for? What are they finding in those images that is what they choose to represent to commemorate or to represent their love of Fellini. And so those are the sort of things that are a little bit harder to kind of figure out, but usually that's where we turn to the kind of cues of interpretation. Lastly, in terms of intimacy, it's not surprising on Instagram that we might see this, right? Because Instagram tends to be a more, and you also see it on Pinterest, tends to be, both those platforms tend to be more female dominated platforms. They have a higher percentage of female users. So I'm wondering, let's say if we look to something like Twitter, right, which tends to be a little bit more male skewed, you know, what might we find in different platforms? So that's where the research will probably continue in that way.
In terms of what you're saying about intimacy, that also ties into Italianità. So when COVID came out and there was, you know, Italy was so hard hit at the beginning, people were talking, well, of course, Italians love to mingle and be close to one another and hug each other and so forth. So I suspect there's also some sort of connection between emphasizing Fellini's capacity for intimacy and as an Italian director. I'm just guessing, but that's just something that occurs to me.
So if I may, I would like to sort of interject and include Eleonora's paper also in the discussion, because it seems to me that the strong kind of like remediation that is in John Waters' practice is sort of in a way already gesturing to what will happen with the recirculation of the Fellini images, the appropriation, the rereading, the remolding that is possible through digital media and especially the social media. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting, and what I try to present, it's this idea that what Waters did with Fellini's film and Fellini's influence, it was already done by Fellini. We have seen with other sources, paintings and comics, because usually there are not many interviews or articles in which Waters speak directly about the importance of Fellini in his work. But usually the discourse is framed in a way which Waters had this opposite kind of passion, the one for horror, exploitation movies, and watching this drive-in with his friends, and this other intellectual side. So usually it's phrased in this way of like two different stream of influences, that the art cinema of Bergman and Fellini, and then the sexploitation and horror movies. And instead, like, it seems to me that the way of mixing these different genres and different media was taught also to Waters by Fellini, because that kind of contamination is already at place. Of course, the influence of Fellini then is charged with many different elements that are alien to Fellini, because of course we can talk about the Tommy Dammit and how it's sort of the mimicking the B movies and horror movies, but the degree of interest for horror movies in Fellini is not comparable to the one for Waters. Well, one thing that I find it interesting listening to Jaqueline is the fact that Waters is also extremely present on social media, and especially Instagram. There are like many pages and accounts that dedicated and daily. There are and there is a lot of fun production of new images, and there is really tons of things. So I don't know if it's connected in some way. I was thinking why directors such as Fellini or Waters draw so much attention in this way, in this sort of like reappropriation by fans and yeah, memes, and the fandom seem to respond in for example, like, I don't know, I don't think that the same response we can think for Antonioni on the social media. I don't know. Yeah, sorry, that's all.
Thank you so much. I wasn't checking the chat, so I apologize to Daniela Bini, who had a question for Jackie, I believe.
Yeah, it's
Daniela?
more than a question. Can you hear me? Yes. It's also a comment, because I too was struck by the intimacy, and I have to say I'm totally ignorant with this. I don't do Instagram, I don't do Twitter, I don't do any of that, not even Facebook. So the fact of the intimacy, I think, yes, it might be, as you said, characteristic, and Frank, you're right, of the Italian, character a little bit too. But I think I'm very curious about the people who have, put those images, because I think they want to know about the human being. They want about the man, Fellini. They don't want to know about the director. And the one that actually impressed me most, maybe because, and Frank knows, but I worked on the female representation in some of Fellini's drawings and film, is the one where he's hugging Masina. I think it's one of the, I've never seen any affectionate, or at least not as endearing and affectionate image of the two of them together. And I think that's what the Italians, maybe is a woman who wants to see the man, the good husband, that he probably wasn't, but, and so that's the beautiful image. And probably she picked the best, don't you think, Jackie or Frank, that you know more about, since I don't know all certainly the photographs and important images of him and Giulietta. So I was really struck by that. And I think since maybe people that put those images, they really want to show that Fellini also was a nice human being, not only a great director. I don't know. That was my feeling. And I was very happy. Thank you for bringing this up, Jaqueline.
Daniela, so nice to see you, and thank you for those observations. I think that you're spot on. What's interesting about social media, just to explain it, it's not just the fact that this is, which photo they use, but this is the most popular photo, right? This is the one with hundreds of thousands of likes, right? Now, part of it was because it was used for the Cinema Ritrovato, right? So it had that kind of connection to the festival. But the fact that they chose that image, right? And then that people like that image, we don't know why they like that image, right? Because, why you like a certain thing can be many reasons, right? That's why, now Facebook has the different, like you can like and be angry or be happy, be sad, for a particular image or for a particular post. So there's a lot of mystery to this. And it's important to do kind of, both a quantitative and a qualitative analysis when one looks at this. Now, I'm really interested in more of a kind of iconography, right? A holistic approach to these individual posts. And again, what is it about them that makes them popular? Right? What is it? And I do believe that photograph, I would love to find out who took it. If it was on the set of La Strada, then we might, or Le Notti di Cabiria, we might have more of a chance, and then I could sort of reconstruct it from there. But thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, could I just ask one thing to Dishani? Thank you. No, I was fascinated because, as we had said when we had the breakout room, I also worked some on his drawings and representation of women, as I said before. I wanted just to know, this is a very banal question, whether, you are, this is a small part of a larger study, and what is your final, aim? What would you like to show or prove with this study? Just the interference of different media, or in collaboration, or you have also a different agenda? That's just a curiosity. Thank you.
Okay,
And
thank you,
very
Daniel.
nice to see everybody. Yes, especially in this moment of lockdown, to see faces and smile. Jacqueline, thank you so much for that beautiful smile. I only see people with masks, Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, for this presentation about Fellini and the link between painting and cinema, the aim was to introduce, of course, the reference that Fellini used on his movie, the reference of painting and painter, but also to put a point of the notion of the concept of the intermediarity, because for my thesis I work with this notion of intermediarity, that how there is some kind of interaction between all kind of media, and I'm passionate by the painting and the cinema because this is what I do like then more like 10 years now. I all the time work with painting for the construction of decor, and I mean setup, and also the cinema, because that was my study and the professional thing. And that's why I want to talk about the two medias of painting and cinema on Fellini's work. But we can also see that on Fellini's work, we have other kind of media also, like we have talked with Daniela at the break room about the literature also. We have also of this kind of media that that Fellini use on his work. And that's it. It's of course the reference and also the intermediarity is the both for me.
That's very interesting. But since the title was also "What Woman for Which Frame," so I was, also hoping to hear something about the woman in the frame. But maybe you will, write more about that as
Yes.
part of your project, I imagine.
Because when I heard that I have only 10 minutes, it was like, okay, I cannot, because it's a very big idea to talk about also frame, because we have a lot of things and talk to the frame of painting and also of the frame on cinema. And it is too short to bring this subject on 10 minutes. I think I should have changed the title for this presentation, because I put very on the heart of this presentation all the drawing of Fellini. That was the central idea of this presentation, but I think maybe for another time I will talk about the frame.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dishani, perhaps you can stretch your legs in the publication that will follow, this conference.
Okay.
So I know that Jackie had a question for Shelleen.
Thanks. So thank you, Shelleen. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really impressed by it, and I'm wondering, and I just sort of thinking about other images and representations of women and people of color in Fellini. I felt you were extremely generous to Fellini in this reading. Are there areas, other films where perhaps you are a bit more critical, or do you usually see Fellini in this kind of sort of decolonial project?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I struggled over that a great deal, in this project. I think, first of all, what you'll notice is that there are a significant number of images of people of color in films that, often are very minor. As with a lot of Italian cinema, a lot of these actors are not credited and often are appearing as, at one point in the paper say decoration or as part of mise en scène. We can also see the use of blackface performance within Fellini as well. And so what I wanted to do in terms of framing these images was to really think about the way in which his cinema as a whole has attempted to engage questions of racial identity. and the colonial legacy, what I'm calling the colonial legacy, Italy's colonial legacies. And so I tried to pave a way where it wasn't so much about positive, negative, but really looking at the ways in which he is incorporating racial difference within the text itself. And what does that tell us about the ways in which we read Fellini, what we've sort of ignored within that body of work, and what does it mean to analyze and sort of flesh out those kinds of images. And I think because of their fleeting quality, one aspect of their fleeting quality is that we tend to dismiss them. And I think it's all too readily. Because I think that engagement with the colonial legacy, particularly fascism, under which he grew up, I think is something that he attends to, not only in films like, AmeriCorps, but he is very attentive to that legacy. And I think you can see it in his body of work, from his earliest works with John Kitzmiller, the African-American actor, in films that he co-directed with La Toada, to even his later works, such as Ginger and Fred, which also engage questions of immigration, African immigration, in very interesting ways. So, Jackie, thank you for asking that question, because I struggled with it throughout, and it's difficult sometimes to watch those films, and to come back to it. But I think for the purposes of the sort of project that was put forward by Frank and Margie, I wanted to try an experiment and to see what would it mean to revise and to consider his work in this way. But I hope I didn't come off as an apologist. That is certainly not what I wanted.
Juliana had a comment. Juliana, you're muted.
I unmuted you. I always tell people you're muted, and now I did it. Okay. So I wanted to thank everybody for the wonderful presentations. And, as Daniela said, it's wonderful to see faces and people that, I've not been seeing for a while. So it's great. Thank you for this occasion and getting together and talk about Fellini. I have a comment and a question. The comment is for Jaqueline about this project that is very exciting because it brings Fellini to the present, to the now. And I was very intrigued by your findings of this very intimate shot of Fellini. And then the question of, the meaning of this choice, of images of intimacy. And I was thinking early on in your talk how you framed your consideration about this notion of social media as a moment of participation and democratization. And so I was wondering that I think there is a connection there between this looking at Fellini in the intimate space, in a sort of everyday space, with a way to humanize and a way of being on the stage, bringing the stage down from the spectacular, the monumental that he very often, he sort of, deploys, right? And bringing it back down to a space of everydayness, of share intimacy. It's as if you share the intimacy with him, So I think that this notion of the private image, as a sort of democratized image, an image in which, you share and partake is, I think, something that is there, in the images that you show, and it really resonated with your initial framing of the question. So thank you. But, and I did work a little bit with the photos, not just of Secchiaroli, but Franco Pinna. You might want to look at Franco Pinna because he worked on the stage of Fellini's films up to, I think, Juliet of the Spirits. He was a sort of intimate collaborator. So thank you. So that is a comment. But then I had a question for Eleonora. And I was wondering, you know, how, you know, so you gave this definition of camp, and I was wondering how queerness changes camp, you know, and so how John Waters' camp can sort of help us reapproach and reread and look with different eyes to Fellini's campness. So I don't know if you thought about it, but that's something that I was thinking about during your presentation.
Thank you for the question. For sure, the approach to queerness that Fellini had and Water has is very different. But if we stick with Sontag's definition, which has been questioned and improved, but like if we stick with that, the challenge to heterosexuality and to gender identities is essential to camp, no matter what is the orientation or the inclination of whoever appropriate camp identity. So I think when I was thinking about the queerness, and I was also thinking about agency, and it's something that I wanted to talk about, but then it was too much for the 10 minutes. And because I was thinking, what is the fundamental difference between Waters' camp aesthetic and Fellini's camp aesthetic? And to me, it's really about agency and the degree of participation that the director has with the subject. And I don't know, I hope if somebody that is more experienced in Fellini studies can correct me, but I see it as Fellini had a deeply fascination for queer culture and for drag queens, but it was not his world in the sense that he did not belong to the community. So it was surrounded by these people, by this culture that he loved and he was fascinated about. And to me, his position is well described in Fellini's Roma, which I know we shouldn't read in an autobiographical way, but this young man who comes to Rome and he's completely taken away by what is happening around him, but he's always an external observer and who loves what he sees, but it does not belong. It's the position to me that Fellini has towards camp and towards queer culture, whereas Waters, he had his friends performing in his film, and a lot of the scenes and a lot of the things he described were really his daily life. And this is, to me, the biggest difference between a character like Saragina, obviously has a short part and is not just as well developed as Divine, but if you compare these exuberant women and camp images in Fellini and the one in Waters, is really a matter of agency and belonging to a certain community that happened in Waters, but does not completely in Fellini, I think. I don't know if I understand, if I answer the question.
Yes, thank you. I was exactly thinking, in a way, another way to think it is that Waters sort of went back to neorealism in a way, because, you know, he brought the camp in the streets of Baltimore, in the neighbors of Baltimore, among his friends, you know, and there was this sense of, you know, sort of improvisation, you know, and letting people be themselves on the stage, you know, and that is something quite, you know, different, definitely from the later Fellini, when, you know, he gave the lines to his actors, not lines to recite, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then they would be, you know, dubbed over with the real dialogue, you know. So the actors were really used as props, you know. I think that is an example from Satyricon. So I think that you really touched on something, the agency as a sort of, you know, an important
But just quickly about the improv or the stage, I found it interesting. I think Water explained this in the live commentary to Multiple Maniacs that was really restored a few years ago by Criterion, and he says that there was very little improvisation in his film, and people think that they were just in front of the camera acting out themselves, but he said in fact we seems like so out of it and kind of amateurish, but everything was really scripted and they have to memorize, and the problem was that they usually shoot once a week, so the production was very long, but he says everything was scripted and everybody has to memorize their lines. So even there is a sort of illusion that it seems that it plays like as it happens, but instead there was this theatricality that I was talking about. It was planned ahead to a certain extent, at least.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Again, the unmuting will happen to anybody at any point. Thank you again. This is a really fascinating conversation. I'm wondering if there are any more questions from the conference participants today from the keynote. And if not, I will ask one last kind of question for the entire panel. And it has to do with something that Dishani actually talked about in terms of like, you know, the cinematization sort of like of the cinematic becoming painting, and the process that, you know, that it takes in Fellini, you know, to going from dreams to paper to shooting to editing, which it might speak in a way to think something that Adam Egoyan mentioned earlier about the sort of like the density of the, I'm trying to find my notes, the density of Fellini's images. So I'm wondering if those sort of like keywords evoke any kind of thinking that is related to the particular sub aspects that also have to do with subcultures that are originated or in some ways entangled with the Fellini narrative, largely construed. Speaking, you know, I'm speaking about the films, the biography, the remediation of the images, and so on and so forth. If you have any thoughts about this.
Okay, can you just explain differently, because I did not catch some kind of word, just to repeat?
Yeah, I was really struck by sorry, I was really struck by what you said in terms of the intermedial relationship that Fellini's imagery has, and it seems to me that you know, a number of your observations, and I'm saying yours in terms of like the panel, take that concept into different directions and different avenues where that process has actually happened, and perhaps became, you know, social media, or became expressed through camp aesthetics in somebody else's cinema, and you know, to some degree even I say that it's possible to see in Shelleen's kind of, you know, retrieval of the colonial unconscious from the architecture that surrounds the film, you know, another way to, you know, go between film history and history. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts that, you know, might, connect the different papers, you know, through this idea of intermediality. And if you don't, that's also okay. It might be just like the thoughts that came to me by listening to these absolutely wonderful papers.
No, it's a good thought, because I have to think about that, because of course we can put some link between and a common points between the social media, also the queers culture, the camp, and the historical thing with the painting. But I think we have maybe like we need more like few minutes to answer about this question, because it's a very preciously question. But I don't know. I know that the notion of about intermediarity is to bring different kind of media. Like I said, painting, cinema. In Fellini, also talk with my professor, Viva Paci, the think about the literature, but we can also have about the music also, the how the media of the music is entered by the work of Fellini. But maybe I don't know. I'm thinking about the. I don't know if it. I don't know. It's the same word in English to French, like la culture populaire. Yes, the culture, popular culture. Maybe will be the point. I mean, the central point of all these ideas that we just talked this morning. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know if Eleonora, Shelleen, or maybe Jaqueline have another answer about that.
If I may, I think that the density of Fellini's cinema is, at least I'm speaking like from a personal point of view, is the beauty, the richness, but also the frustration, because a lot of films watching now, not just for the conference, but as a viewer, are either fascinating and frustrating for certain elements. And me personally, I found it hard to understand the point of view and to understand the message. There are a lot of themes, a lot of issue when you read back the comments right after La Dolce Vita came out, and people reading it as a criticism towards capitalism, or people reading it as a way to condone the very same thing, and the same can be said about gender, or about the treatment of race, and it seems like kind of very smart answer that he gave, which is the same answer that Waters gave. I don't have anything to say. I really don't want to say anything, and we can wonder if it's really true, if they are so naive that they're just putting up images just for fun. But it is this density that I don't know, at least myself, maybe because I don't know enough, but it always leave me as sort of in doubt of where to position myself, because usually, like, from an aesthetic experience, you have this sort of, I don't know, complete community with what you see, but then you start to deconstruct or to criticize, and I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying. These sort of like mixing genres and taking different stances, it's really what keep these films alive and always open to interpretation, but also frustrating, because you are always in doubt if you're reading it correctly, if there is some undertone that you're missing, or yes.
If I can jump in, I mean, I would just say that film's always been intermedial, you know, from its inception, right? There were always cross-pollinations between visual culture, print culture. It never existed in isolation. What I think is unique about Fellini, and it would be really interesting to see what would happen, how he might make a movie about media today, is that his films engage with media as it develops, right? And as certain new technologies come in. So where we have either television or advertising or commodity culture or consumerism, and how those are and how his films interrogate them. So I think you know, how Fellini engages with media is I think particularly unique, because he himself was intermedial, right, with his drawings and his paintings, etc. But to sort of attribute a kind of a special intermediality to him, I think would be erroneous, because film is always intermedial, right?
Frank, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just responding to what Eleonora said. I think this sense of confusion is exactly what Fellini wants. And I think it goes back to something that Adam was saying, that art is really meant to give you a new experience of things. So it's not necessarily something to leave you with conclusions, to leave you with interpretations. And for me, my experience of being in this game for so long is that I mean, the two major approaches, I think, to cinema studies for so long were semiological. I mean, they were basically language-based, paradoxically, for Fellini. But there was semiology and ideological criticism. So the artwork was out there and it was to be interpreted, and basically it was to be deconstructed, because in an ideological world, everything is ideological and the artist is no better than anybody else. I think what Adam was saying is that the artist is different. The artist offers different experiences, and those experiences aren't always assimilable to the kinds of interpretive strategies that have developed within the discipline. So one of the things that was really exciting for me in doing the companion to Federico Fellini is seeing how the discipline is shifting now, and it's beginning to talk about things like hapticity, about intensity, about neurocognitive experiences that are not just conceptual and are not intended to reduce films and what then became called cultural production, because we could no longer use the term art. That it doesn't, no longer just approaching those things as somehow symptomatic. So I think the frustration on a kind of intellectual level is something that Fellini would say right on. Be confused, but be inspired to, you know, pursue the complexities, and also not cut yourself off from the experience itself of encountering his work. That's first and foremost what he wants people to respond to, is the experience, and then from that to make what you want of it. And if confusion is part of that, that's a perfectly good thing. So at any rate, that's just sort of where I'm at in my relationship to his work right now.
Well, thank you, Frank. And I want to thank the panelists, of course, and the keynote speaker, and everybody who joined us today in the live stream, which will be made available also on our YouTube channel, Department of Italian Studies, that is. We have reached the end of the first session, and we are going to now go in camera, so to speak, into breakout rooms where we can continue these conversations indefinitely. Perhaps we'll be here tomorrow morning too, and just roll straight into the next session, which will begin promptly at 9:30 a.m.